For the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about historical styles as they progress over time in Western art. In Western art, we're talking about primarily European art styles as opposed to Middle Eastern or Asian or Pacific art styles and cultures. Art style are responding to questions that Western art is dealing with. When we're talking about historical, we're looking at certain time periods, kingdom, country, where the arts display nameable, repeated, and recognizable characteristics. So we're talking about the form of the art itself. So we might be looking at space. What does space typically look like when an artist in that time period organizes his composition? Or what do colors look like? The depiction of the human body, that within a time period it can be either very naturalistic, where it can be more abstracted. These characteristics are across a time period and are found in the artwork of multiple artists. Every time period has an early, a classical or high time period that demonstrates all the main characteristics, and a later period that is losing some of the characteristics and gaining some of the new characteristics, leading to the next historical time period. But the classical period usually is maintained for longer than the early or late style period. When we have a change in style, it's usually attributed to something in the context. In ancient art, the changes coincide with the rise and fall of empires and kingdoms. So there we talk about Egyptian art, Greek art, Assyrian art that have a certain number of characteristics that last over a period of time. And in ancient art, these time periods can be quite long. The Roman Empire, about 500 years. Egyptian kingdoms last for much longer, thousands of years. Each period is not a consistent length. During traditional art periods, before the rise of democracy, those tend to be approximately 100 years of time. And finally, when we get to modern times, we get a real condensation of art styles and movements within 50 to 100 years. The changing political events that you might already be aware of, for example, the rise of democracy and fall of monarchs during the time of the French and American and Russian Revolution. We go from a very authoritarian political structure to a more democratic one. We've already talked a little bit about new knowledge. So, for example, the observation of the natural world changed the subject matter, changed how artists looked at the world and how they depicted it. Later on, changes in social conditions like the rise of the middle class. Here is an example where the Middle Ages is broken down to Romanesque art and later Gothic. This little relief sculpture here is from a sarcophagus, and a sarcophagus is a casket basically made out of stone. And what we see here, we see some figures representing perhaps the person who lies buried there, but we see some definite Christian symbols here. We see the cross here. We also see continuity between the earlier Roman time period, the Corinthian capitals, the sculpture of these figures, in that they are taking the classical contrapposto form, which is one knee forward and your weight on a back knee. Why does this early Christian art show remnants of ancient Roman art? There was a transition from paganism to Christianity at the time of the Emperor Constantine. Christian artists were used to things being characterized as the Romans did them. So if you look at the figure here, it's a little bit, looks childish because the proportions are different than what we expect in an adult. The head seems larger, the body and legs seem shorter. As we move to the next time period, we go to something that's actually less realistic. And this time period in the Middle Ages, and here we see a capital on a column And you can see that there's a certain awkwardness to the figures. They still are recognizable, but they're quite distorted and elongated. They seem to have larger heads, and this style has changed. And even the clothing has changed. Here they've turned into kind of a stylized pattern. A little bit later, these are sculptures, and you can see that they are still really elongated, and they're very much tied to the post in the background. The clothing is highly stylized, very patterned. The emphasis on the faces and hands. And the feet are uncomfortable in the space because they look like they're falling down rather than projecting out. There is a loss of naturalism, and that has disappeared and been replaced by this kind of stylized characterization of people. And then finally we have the Gothic era, and you can see that they have become much more naturalistic. There was a return to classical ideas, some of the stylistic characteristics of Greek and Roman art. And you can see that here we have a very believable body. It gives a very naturalist turn to the body. And notice the drapery of the clothing as well, especially here I'm seeing how naturalistic that clothing looks. This is an example of the change where we go from early, middle, and late time periods. I want to look at Egyptian art and the stylistic characteristics of Egyptian art, and I've chosen a painting, a sculpture, and some architecture. Egyptian style tends to be much more massive. We have a lotus blossom and then the head of the goddess Bes. Here we have a typical Egyptian sculpture which looks very formal, very stiff. You'll notice that the body is not free. The arms are to the side or pinned to the front because they're carved out of a single block of stone. This is the pharaoh Menkaure, and this is his wife next to him. He wears the attributes of his office, the crown of a pharaoh, and he's wearing the pharaonic beard as well. We do notice some naturalism in the arms, the chest, but when we look here at the clothing, we see that they're more or less shapes, usually filled with color. These sculptures of pharaohs were painted. An example of the coloring would be in this tomb painting. I love these paintings because if you zoom in really close, you can see that the Egyptians were quite capable of a beautiful type of naturalism. Great detail, texture, and pattern. So here we have a cat, and you can see his fur and the individual feathers of the bird. Papyrus is more stylized again. These pictures have some beautiful movement, whereas the figures tend to be more stiff and in the classical Egyptian pose. A combination of a side view of the face and a front view of the eye, full view of the shoulders as if they're twisted straight to the front to show the right arm, the arm of power of the king. And we have the body twisted sideways again, so we see the side of the hip, enables us to see the legs in their movement. Across the Mediterranean, the Greek culture. This is an early Greek temple. It has many of the characteristics of all Greek temples. It is a post and lintel system supported by columns. It has an entablature with a frieze and then the pediment up here. Later on the Acropolis, the Temple of Athena, these columns become taller and thinner and more elegant. Everything had to fit together in perfect proportion. They experimented with a different number of columns, and if you count the columns in each temple, you will see that the perfect temple is the example we find at the Parthenon, with a number of columns to give this feeling of perfection. Here is an example of Greek painting. We have many amphora, which are two-handled vessels that the Greeks used for multiple purposes, for carrying water, for storing wine. They were also used for trophies for the Olympic Games, and they were often highly decorated. in these paintings are stories of the gods. Here we have a story at the Greeks and the Amazons, and here we see the final death of the Queen of the Amazons as she is being slayed by the hero Achilles. You'll notice that there is a lot of action in these Greek figures intertwined in the combat. Notice the shift in proportion. The important part of the body is the strength of Achilles. The feet tend to be minimized. We have that also in the Amazon Queen. This is a very interesting story. This is the point in the battle just before he kills her. When they look eye to eye, he is struck by the knowledge that he is going to kill the woman he loves. We have decorative patterns at the foot of the amphora and at the neck of the amphora, swirls and decorative patterns to fill the space in the background. Space is still a very flat, shallow space. Over here we have a Greek statue of Zeus. You'll notice the anatomical perfection of Zeus. Notice this stance, this comfortable, relaxed stance. This is the contrapposto stance that I was talking about, with one knee forward, to have the hips shifted, the shoulders shifted, and the head slightly turned to give this very naturalistic pose. Drapery that is carved deeply here to give us these deep shadows. We feel like this clothing is actually on his body and being shaped by the muscles of his leg underneath. Greek sculpture tends to have what we call a classical face, which is a face that does not show expression, that is calm, very rational, which goes with the philosophy at the same time. Later on in the Greek styles, we get Hellenistic style sculpture, which are much more dramatic. But the proportions are different, the decorations are different as we compare them here to a Persian column. These rather straightforward column styles are also part of what you will see in Egyptian construction. And here we have a Persian column which has a much more shortened shaft and a much taller capital. And you can see the double bulls up here. If you get a chance, you ought to go to the Oriental Institute at the Museum of Chicago. It has wonderful Persian columns, and that they have a head of this bull, and it is awesome.